Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about how you can use CSS, let's talk a little bit about the properties of, that you have to work with, and um, a little bit about how you can use CSS to lay out your website. All right, the first property that you should be aware of is the CSS units of measurement. This chart shows you all the valid properties for measurement in cascading style sheets. I'm not going to go through every one, but I am going to point out a couple of the more useful ones and why they're useful. The first one is the percentage measurement, and the percentage measurement is useful if you are going to create a layout and only want a certain fraction of a screen to be taken up by a given element. Let's say you wanted the left-hand column of a web page to be 25% of the screen. You could use 25%, and then the left-hand column would be 25% of it. The percent measurement is primarily used for with doing what's called a fluid layout, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Um, I really never use the inch, centimeter, or millimeter properties in cascading style sheets. Um, However, they may be useful if you were going to do what's called using CSS for creating a printer-friendly page, because you may want to specify um, units of measure related to what a page size would be for a printed bit of text, because you can specify different cascading style sheets, whether they're used for a printer or you're using them for a to be the screen layout. One useful measurement is EM, which is equal to the current font size of 1M. And so the EM measurement is relative to the font size that is currently being used. So if the font size is 12 points, then 2 EMs is 24 points. And the M, the reason they call it EM is it's the measure of the size of an M at whatever font size is being used. The 1EX isn't used isn't used too much, is the height of a font. Um, Points, PT, that measurement is primarily used with um, that's used with fonts. All right, so you may have seen a 12-point font or a 14-point font. That is the measurement that is used for defining fonts. Uh, Pica is a shorthand for it, so PC is equal to 12 points. And if you're doing layouts, one of the most common measurements for layouts is pixels, or PX, and the pixel is the equivalent to approximately one dot on the computer screen. So pixels are useful for fixed width layouts, because whenever you measure a computer screen, they're measured in dots, and so some screen resolutions are 800 by 600 points, some are 640 by 480. Most modern ones today are 1024 by 768 or above. So if you're going to have a fixed um, layout, a lot of times you're going to use the PX uh, unit of measurement. This page right here gives you an index of all the cascading style sheet properties available. So if you want to do a little more research on what you have to work with, this page will give you a list. Now, There are some other properties. We're not going to go through every property in CSS, but we're just going to talk about a couple of them. In CSS, to specify the color, you can use these options for color. You can either say one of the colors listed here, like aqua, black, blue, fuchsia, gray, green, lime, maroon, navy, olive, etc. Or you can use the RGB color code. And if you use Photoshop, you may be familiar with the color code. You can also, for fonts, you can specify the font of a page or a section of a page. These are some examples of the fonts that you can use to specify for your page. And finally, we're going to talk about one of the things that can be a little bit difficult for people that are transitioning from the traditional way of doing page layouts, which has been to use tables to lay out your page. The way you do it with using cascading style sheets is using the layout properties to create your page design. And so here we have a list of properties here. So you need to be able to use measurements, position. You will find these properties here, and we're going to go through some of these, but you won't see all of these used until we go through the example. All right, the one bit of, like, let's say, theory behind CSS that you need to understand is what's called the CSS box model. All right, and the box model is used for creating layouts. So it's really important you understand how this works because you're going to use this a lot. All right, the first, and it's pretty simple. If you look at here, this black line here represents what's called the border property. Okay, and then everything outside the border, around in this area, is the margin. Everything between the border and your content is called the padding, and then the inside right here is the content area. So if I'm going to specify a margin, that is going to move my box away from any other element. And if I'm going to specify padding, then the padding will move my content away from the border, the internal border of the box. And we'll see how this works in the example. But it's important to understand how this works because once you can you conceptualize the box model, creating layouts in CSS becomes relatively easy. And you have a lot of flexibility in what you can do, a lot more so than with tables. Now, the reason why using the CSS layout properties is better to do than, let's say, creating a layout in tables is a couple reasons. One, if you create your layout with cascading style sheets, you can control the layout of your page with the style sheet rather than the embedded tables that are inside your content. The next reason why you would use it's better to use cascading style sheets versus tables for page layout is that if you're using tables for your page layout, what happens is that the table structure has a tendency to confuse the search engines that are looking through your page. It's not able to identify the difference between a table used for, let's say, data display and a table used for page layout. So your pages many times will be ignored by the search engine because if people have described their pages using what they call semantic terms such as content or navigation for page elements on a CSS design, the search engine can understand what is content and what is necessarily a menu, versus on a table where a search engine just looks at a web page created with a table layout as one page and no identifiable regions to uh, identify what is actually content or what is a menu. Um, and finally, the other advantage to using CSS layouts versus tables is that the pages should load faster because there'll be less markup for it. And the other thing is whenever you look at your HTML page as a person, HTML that doesn't have table in it, it's obviously easier to read than HTML that does use tables. Um, so you can use tables for data display. Let's say you were going to display a chart or something like that, or you were going to actually format something that should be in a table like an Excel spreadsheet like look. You can still use tables for data display, but you don't ever want to use tables for page layout. One thing you might see in CSS is what I call CSS shorthand. You may see CSS shorthand primarily in paddings and margins. And if you see something like this where you see the property padding and then you have a colon and you see 25, 50, 75, 100, that's what this is. It's top padding, right padding, bottom padding, left padding. So that's how this is read by the should be read. So it goes top, right, bottom, left. An important property also for layouts is what's called the CSS float. And you can either float things to the right or to the left. And all the CSS float is doing is saying where should the content flow around? Should it flow to the text to the left or to the right? We're going to look at an example of this to see exactly how these properties interact with content on your page. If you're going to use float, you also need to be able to use the clear property. So the clear property, all it does is to remove the float. So it tells the text to stop wrapping to the left or stop wrapping to the right, or to stop wrapping to both, depending on how you have the float set. So basically, use the float to wrap text around things and use clear to stop the text wrapping or wrapping of any other items. CSS properties of width and height are used to identify how big an area of an element is. You can use pixels, you can use percent, you can use pica, inches, whatever sort of measurements you want to use, you can use that for your width and height. Primarily, you're going to use pixels or you're going to use percent for width and height. And you only need to specify the width and height if you are requiring that to be a certain size. And that's useful whenever you're going to create a layout. There are three types of layouts. There are in general, there are two types of layouts. There is what's called a fluid layout or a fixed layout. A fluid layout is it's good, and basically what a fluid layout does is it will expand or contract the size of the page or how much content is displayed on the page based on the size of a person's screen. So in a fluid layout, you're going to use percent layout measurements. So if, let's say, you wanted the content to take up 75% of someone's screen, you could say that a content area should be 75% width, and then that content area, no matter if the person is viewing it on a very large monitor or a very small monitor, it will take up 75% of the screen area. Fluid layouts are better for different screen resolutions. However, fluid layouts are bad for design since it, to a certain extent, limits what you can do. And in many cases, this may not be a problem. In some cases, it is. And the reason it limits what you can do is because since the layout is going to expand or contract depending on the size of a person's screen, you're going to have you can't put some items. You can't basically anticipate where items are going to be on the screen when you're putting them there. So that, let's say you thought that a graphic, let's say you're going to put a graphic in the far right hand corner. Maybe on your smaller screen, the graphic in the far right hand corner looks okay, but then on somebody else's larger screen, that graphic is going to be much farther to the right, and it's going to look unbalanced. So when you're designing for a fluid width layout, you have to take into account the design, that the design is going to change from your monitor to someone else's monitor because everybody's going to have a different size screen. Many people go with a fixed layout. Now, a fixed layout is not great for different resolutions because the fixed layout is always going to look the same on one person's screen versus another person's screen. So let's say you create a page that is designed to be viewed on a monitor that is using a 1024 by 768 resolution, and somebody goes to your page and they have an 800 by 600 resolution. Well, some of your page is going to is going to run off the side of the screen because your page is going to be larger than what their monitor can display. The fixed layout is good for design because what you see is what you get. So whatever you see on your screen is going to be basically what someone else sees on their screen. And a fixed layout is going to use absolute value. So you're going to see in fixed layouts that you're going to use pixels or EMs to size the layout because you're going to have to say that pieces of the layout are exactly the same size or a precise size. You can't really use percentages with a fixed layout. There are hybrid layouts, which some people might refer to as elastic layouts. And elastic layouts sort of blend fluid and fixed layouts to give some of the benefits of a fluid layout and some of the benefits of a fixed layout. However, an elastic layout or a hybrid layout is much more difficult to design, and we're not going to go over how that is actually created. This little bit of information is very important. If you're going to use the first types of layouts that you should try to create are fixed width layouts. And in order to create a fixed width layout, you're going to need to specify the width of the page. And in this case, what you're going to do is say that if you're going to design for screens that are 1024 by 768 resolution, you're going to use a width of approximately 980 pixels. If you're going to use a screen that's 800 by 600, then you're going to design for 760 pixels. You can also design use CSS to specify how a page is going to be printed, and if you're designing a print CSS file, the width of the page should be less than 560 pixels. And you can use the media tag to change the style of the sheet used for printing. That isn't something we're going to cover in this lesson, but it's important to know that you can identify what style sheet should be used for printing versus what you want to use for display on a person's computer screen. Okay, finally, the One last thing to know about CSS is that there is a thing called a CSS pseudoclass. And basically a CSS pseudoclass is used to add a special effect to some types of selectors. The most common pseudoclass is this. Let's say you want to style a link and you want to have 4 different properties. So you want the link to look one way whenever it is just a link that hasn't been clicked. That would be a::link. Then you could have a::hover. That would be a link that whenever the person hovers their mouse over the link, it changes color or does something else. So maybe in this case, whenever I was hovering over a link, the color would be red for the link, versus whenever I didn't hover over the link, it would be blue. You can use a::active to specify what is the active page. So if someone already clicked on a number of web pages and they happen to be on one of the pages that they clicked on, then the link for that page is considered active, and you could specify the color green for the link. And here in another one, you could say for links that people have clicked on but are not active, you would use the visited property, and you could say that the color of the link is gray. And finally, one of the biggest challenges to becoming an expert with cascading style sheets is handling, um, let's say, bugs or problems that the different browsers have with interpreting cascading style sheets. If there was one reason not to use a cascading style sheet, this would be it. The problem is that primarily um, Internet Explorer 6 and most other Microsoft web browsers have not conformed to the international standard on cascading style sheets. They've conformed to it, let's say 97%, but there are going to be, a 3% difference between what is Microsoft's browsers are going to render a web page at and what another browser such as Safari or Firefox or Chrome is going to render a web page. And so to handle this, what you need to be aware of is that for Internet Explorer knows that there's a problem with this, and they built into their browser the ability to create what's called a conditional CSS statement. And here's the example here. I put this statement around a CSS rule, all right, or a CSS style sheet, and if Internet Explorer comes to the page, what it'll do is it's going to load this style sheet or whatever styles are within this conditional statement and apply them rather than applying the styles that every other browser would apply. It's We're not going to cover how to do this for Internet Explorer, but because there's so many different bugs that Internet Explorer 6 has, it's something that you just need to, if you encounter the bug where, let's say a page looks fine in Firefox or in Internet Explorer 7, because 7 is much better, then you will know that you can fix those bugs by using a conditional statement for Internet Explorer 6. And it's just here is to say the conditional statement starts off with the bracket exclamation point, and then the main thing to know that you can do here is it says if GT IE6, the GT stands for greater than, you can use less than, or if you don't put anything at all, it will just identify if the browser is Internet Explorer 6, it will do whatever is inside here. And there are probably 90 or so bugs in Internet Explorer 6 that cause it problems for rendering CSS content. And if you happen to encounter one of those bugs, the best thing to do is to look it up on Google and come up with the fix for it. But IE6 is becoming less of an issue because it's a fairly old browser and not as many people have it. But you may want to deal with it, because it does still exist. This link is for a tutorial on how to create layouts. There's a website called A List Apart, which is basically um, one of the more respected online resources for uh, web design. And so this article is fairly famous. It's called the Holy Grail layout. And basically, the Holy Grail layout is one of the most common three-column layouts, where you have a header, three content columns, one for left navigation and right navigation, and a footer at the bottom. If you want to use CSS layouts, I highly recommend that you work through this tutorial. Now we're going to go through and I want to work through some examples of different ways to use CSS for layouts in our examples, but this article is very good because it explains a lot of um, the terminology and the theory behind how to produce different types of layouts. Now, another thing to be aware of is that there are what's called CSS frameworks. Now, if you start to make a lot of web pages, you may want to investigate a CSS framework such as the Blueprint CSS. And what a CSS framework is basically a collection of cascading style sheet files. All right, so there's a number of style sheets that have been pre-set up and designed to be configurable by the person using them to generate their layouts. Now, I don't recommend that you go and try to use a CSS framework initially, because you're going to need to learn how CSS works first. But if once you understand how CSS works and you want to go further in your knowledge, definitely look up the Blueprint CSS framework or other ones. They'll save you a lot of time and help you to improve your design skills for making web pages look better, because they include functions in them, or abilities, pre-built templates of fonts and, or let's say, typography and layout and things that are make it easier for you to implement. This concludes the lesson on cascading style sheets. You should watch the tutorials on how to create your own cascading style sheet designs that are included with this lecture. These tutorials provide examples of how to implement CSS designs. They include examples of how to construct layouts, how to style hover links for rollover effects, how to create a horizontal or vertical menu using ordered or unordered lists. Thank you.